Hello, welcome to the Media Club. I'm your host, Matt Deegan. In the club today, do we need a Hippocratic oath for journalism? Journalist and author Mic Wright has been in UK newsrooms to deduce whether there's an ethical line beyond don't get sued. Also on the show, the BBC sets out its stall for charter renewal. PR supremo Will Wood is here to take us through Tim Davey's wishlist. All that, plus the AI copyright bill suffers another setback, and there's more cuts at Disney and Business Insider. And in the Audio Network quiz, we look at some life hacks for media hacks. That's all happening in this edition of the Media Club. Come on in. Mick, thank you for joining us. First time on the sofa. Your membership card will await you in the post. But who else would you like to add to the gang? Well,
I wanted to nominate Ben Lowry, who's the editor of the Belfast newsletter, which is the oldest continuously published newsletter in English. And they've just put nearly 300 years worth of their back catalogue onto online in collaboration with the British Library. And I've just written a book where I'm hugely critical of newspapers, but I think this is like a very positive local news story about heritage of local newspapers. Belfast Newsletter is a strange newspaper because it was originally a Republican newspaper and now it's been unionist for a long time. But you're talking about a newspaper that was being published before we adopted the Gregorian calendar, years and years before the Titanic, which claimed to have a scoop on the American Declaration of Independence. Now turns out that actually two London newspapers scooped it first. But it's just really fascinating, and I think it's really kind of amazing to have 300 years of continuous newspaper publishing online and accessible for people for free if they have a library card, basically.
It's an amazing resource for anybody writing anything about the history of that area or the country as a whole.
Yeah, 100%. And you can go back and look and see that the papers, they look quite different, but actually at their root they're quite similar. There's still a lot of gossip and crime stories, and if it bleeds, it leads. It's all there. So yeah, I just thought that was a kind of brilliant story, and a brilliant story about a newspaper that's still going as well.
And Will, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
Who have you got to nominate this week?
So I'm nominating, and I have to say there is a disclaimer with this because I do know him, and we work with him, and he is a mate. So
That's allowed.
I hope he's going to blush if he's listening, and I hope he is. But I am nominating Rupert Majendie, who is a producer who works for Baby Cow, but I would say beyond that, he has just produced The Ballad of Wallis Island, which was released last week. And we spend a lot of time looking at where new comedy talent is coming from and what that pipeline looks like. John Petrie was talking, the head of comedy for BBC, was talking recently at the Comedy Festival about, the need to nurture and feel confident in comedy that is uniquely British as well. And I think Rupert is very humble and will never shout himself, but he runs comedy nights, the most successful of which is Not Too Bag. He puts his own money into short films and so forth, and he's really, he previously did Brian and Charles, which was a short film that he put money into that went on eventually to become a feature film and then got nominated for a BAFTA. So whilst it's slightly awkward nominating someone that you do know, I think he does deserve a shout out at this time when we need comedy more than ever.
Well, two excellent additions to our club roles. Okay, BBC boss Tim Davey has set out his stall for charter renewal at a Deloitte Enders analysis event on Monday. Will, he told delegates that the BBC is venture capital for the UK, which is a pretty good line. Does it always look that way to the public, do you think?
I dare say no one has ever previously thought of the BBC as a venture capital operation. And, you only have to look at the budgets to realise that. But I do think there is something in that. And I think he was particularly talking to the regionalisation of the BBC and the fact that, unlike, most other operations, they can do a regional rollout in areas that they're investing. They're trying to kickstart, media landscape on the ground and media ecosystem, but I do think we have to start thinking of it like that. It feels counterintuitive to think of the BBC as a company because it's taxpayer funded and so forth. But if that is the sort of language that is going to get government and people to take it seriously and realise that we do have an asset that no other country on earth has, that really punches above its weight, that is under growing financial strain, and not without its faults. I mean, I dare say if it was a venture capitalist operation, things would have happened there sooner than they sometimes do. But I do think we have to start seeing the value that the BBC brings, and we're going into, fevered conversations about charter renewals and the role that the BBC plays. And, Mick is arguably better placed than I am to comment on this, but in the sense that we are surrounded by media that is set out to take the BBC down at any opportunity. And I think, Tim Davey does articulate things in very understandable terms for the people that are the decision makers.
Hey, Mick, we've got a kind of a corporate media, some big organisations running a lot of different outlets, a lot of individuals with power as well. Is it right for actually the BBC to try and think of themselves slightly differently? They get a lot of grief from the other media owners, as Will was saying. Is being an investor for good better than being a broadcaster for good?
There's part of me that cringes at the thought of thinking about it like that, but I can see how it makes sense as a tactical use of language. I often think of the media correspondents at a lot of the other newspapers as kind of not really, almost less media correspondents and more anti-BBC correspondents. There's a sense of like, if you can get a story where you can hammer the BBC, and of course the BBC will then cover it themselves ridiculously over the top often. That thing about we all own the BBC, I thought was a more useful one. I think if you frame it as a company too much, then you get into that thing of, I was looking back to when Jerry Paxman was leaving the BBC, and he was sort of almost arguing, why do we even have Radio 1? There are commercial radio stations, don't need Radio 1. If you frame it as a business too much, then your competitors can have an argument saying, well, if you're a business, be a business like the rest of us. That's a worry, I think.
Will, when I saw Tim Davey speak, I mean, it's the sort of the curse of the BBC Director General is there's always a selection of fires that are probably nothing really to do with you, that you are there to put out or at least talk about. Do you think he does a good job of putting the spin on whatever the disaster of the day is?
I think he just does a good job of being really proactive. And, I can't necessarily comment on what he's doing on a kind of very granular level, but he never seems to shy away or duck issues. And I think you accept, if you're the head of the BBC, every week, probably every day, you're going to have someone sticking the boot in or something that's gone wrong. And there are, like any large organisation, you sometimes read about things, and as someone that is passionately, fervently a supporter of the BBC, you think, why are you kicking yourself in this way by not dealing with that thing earlier, whatever it is. But I think I'm not signed up to the Tim Davey fan club. I don't work with him. I have no vested interest in praising him. But I think at a time that you do have to be on the front foot. And I think Mick makes a really good point that all of that said, trying to sometimes get people to understand the value that the BBC brings. And I guess that would be my point on the company element, in that I think sometimes people just imagine that we all fund it and it just goes off and does what it likes, and there's no analysis afterwards as to what value that brings. But I think, but equally, yes, you've got to be really careful, because there are people waiting to bash you, certainly in the commercial sector, and say, why are you doing that? That's our turf.
Just picking up one of the things you said there, Mick, do you think sometimes BBC News takes a little much, maybe too much glee in sort of BBC corporate's failings?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, look, it's a few years back now, but W1A pretty much had it nailed, didn't they? Of the way that the BBC, if there's a BBC scandal story, they will go very heavy on it. I guess the trouble is, with recent things like Hugh Edwards, or in a very different way, Gary Lineker, if they didn't go full in on it, then it's a case of, oh, you're ignoring this, you're underplaying it. But they do have a kind of cult of self-flagellation, which I think can go too far. And I think people within there feel that too.
But there's a massive opportunity for the BBC at the moment, because one of the big things that Tim Davey was talking about was UK IP. And we're at a time, to use obvious examples like Baby Reindeer and Adolescence, that are distinctly UK stories, although talking to universal themes. And so it feels like there's an open door.
Which are sort of the things that we've talked about on the show, actually, about the streamers will never do this very British-orientated stuff.
Yeah, Fool Me Once being a prime example that looks like it's ready-made for ITV. So I think there's case studies, there's evidence there to show why that is actually the direction of travel. And it's also, on a pragmatic level, the direction of travel when budgets are getting tighter and the money is not flowing in from the US and people are having to cut their cloth accordingly. And I would say comedy is far cheaper and knows how to operate in those really tight budgets in a way that sometimes scripted drama doesn't. So maybe from the bad will come good of new original comedy ideas that we'll start seeing.
Another day, another defeat for the government's data bill as the Lords push back again over AI. Mick, the government wants to allow copyrighted works to train AI. Peers have said no. What's going to happen next?
What will happen? I mean,
ask ChatGPT and we'll.
If it keeps ping-ponging back and forth, I mean, the government could use a Parliament Act, force it through. But they are reaching a point where the bill could fall. That has happened before. I think it happened in the late 90s, early 2000s around the European elections bill. But it's been an
odd thing for them to go nuclear over.
Well, I mean, I think they're doing the right thing. I think the government's obsession with growth and their feeling that, well, we must support AA, whatever, is a mistake, because I think that people have to be rewarded for creating things and making things. Generative AI is a thief, and it vomits out facsimiles of things it already knows. It's, I'm married to a professor of AI, and she has a similar feeling about it. I feel we should be fighting against AI being used for creative things and arguing instead, let's have AI doing things like identifying cancers. That's great. AI shouldn't be making creative things because it can't do it very well. And it's a bad route to go down.
Has that boat sailed though?
That boat sailed if you follow the public relations arguments of the big tech companies, but I don't think it makes sense. It also doesn't make sense economically. Look at the value that the creative sector has to the UK. Vastly bigger than a lot of other sectors. We had, in the news a couple of weeks back, a big thing around fishing, and are we screwing over the fishermen? But it's like, fishing is tiny compared to the creative sector, and yet the government seems happy to just sort of say, oh, we'll just give this to AI, and it's a bad way to be.
I was just going to read. So there was a line: over the last decade, the creative industries has increased their output at more than 1.5 times the rest of the economy. You're a major UK employer. You drive growth at home and you project the UK overseas. And it was Lisa and Andy that said that. And it's quite bewildering that it seems like the industry is, the government has not actually consulted the industry. And also because these are ideas that are copyrighted. Even if you don't care about what you might see as bleeding heart creators or artists or whatever, what about law? What about the things that are meant to protect ideas, that if you just try to steamroller something through and use scaremongering tactics, say if you don't vote for this, we can't do that over there, you get into a really dangerous place, I think.
I mean, the government's trying to say that they're suggesting a sort of opt-out for copyright holders rather than a sort of opt-in approach. It's kind of something Google does themselves. But if you say to Google you want to opt out, they will of course opt you out of all Google things. Is this, Mick, just because big tech, there aren't enough big tech providers, in that the power's held in the hands of a few and they can drive this forward?
Yeah, it's partly that. It's partly that they've done a really good job on the hype. They've done a really good job on telling us that this will be the future. I think the problem around anything when you get told this will be the future is this sense of being told things are inevitable. I fully don't believe it's inevitable. It's the same thing with, not just with entertainment, but with journalism. It's arguing, saying, well, actually, no, I think we need to argue and say organic is better. Like we're doing with food, we should look at AI as being like ultra-processed food. Like AI output is not good for us, and it will not be good for creativity in all aspects, and we should fight against it, and we shouldn't say it's inevitable.
And it's nuanced as well, in the sense that, as Mick says, there's parts of AI that will enormously help journalists, and I dare say is already being used by a lot of journalists. But it doesn't have to be all-encompassing in the same way that you can use AI amazingly well within the creative industries, but that doesn't mean when you've got copyrighted work that you should feel fine with government telling you it's inevitable or that it's okay, you'll be protected, when it's work that is increasingly hard to monetize anyway.
Do you think the talent that you work with, is AI on their agenda? Have they thought about it affecting what they do, or hasn't it quite got to that
No,
point yet?
I think massively, yeah. I think it's probably among the chief concerns that people have. I think certainly in TV and film, I think people working perhaps in comedy where it's, there's a lot more direct interaction with your audience, that it's perhaps to a lesser extent until AI can physically stand up on a stage and make an audience laugh. Maybe it can, I don't know. You'd have to, maybe you can find out for us. I mean, we should be more concerned than I am. But yeah, I think it is a big concern. But I do think it's a big concern because of the lack of understanding. And it feels like largely what has happened with this particular bill is that there's just been a lack of clarity. People are asking questions and they're not getting answers that reassure them. But I will also say, in the interests of putting some sort of positive spin on things, we're very quick to criticise government. We've had a decade or more of things just being steamrolled through whatever we think. So let's praise Lisa and Andy and co for listening to the large group of people saying you can't do this, and hope that there is that ongoing engagement. Because I do believe, I do think she actually cares about the industry and her role as culture sec. So let's hope that bears fruit.
It's just got to happen before they get rid of her department.
Well, dare say, yes, that is the other thing. Yeah. This might all need redirecting very soon, yes.
Okay, finally, just before the break, another round of job cuts at Disney, this time focusing on marketing as well as production. Massive cuts at Business Insider. Press Gazette reports it could be half the size it was 3 years ago. I mean, Mick, Business Insider's sort of been transitioning to a kind of paywall offer. It used to be very sort of Google traffic-driven operation. Is this the sort of natural pains of their whole model changing underneath them?
I think that the change in their model is a bit of a distraction when you come through and look at the job titles and amount of time people have spent at the company. To me, it looks like they're going, these people have higher salaries, we're going to cut them out and we're going to force more work onto junior employees, and that's what's actually happening there. That's what it looks like to me.
It's just the old and expensive.
Yeah, and of course AI is a factor again. They're saying, we want 100% of people using AI in their work here, so that's another factor. I'm not in Business Insider, so that's just me surmising, but I think it's always interesting when you see it's all like people with long time served and job titles, and it's just let's cull them and force junior staff to work a lot harder.
How much do you think of that, though, is, if that is the case, I'm sure they would probably say it wasn't, but if it is the case, it's like our model does not work. We cannot afford the scale of that staff, and if we don't make those changes, we're done.
Well, if you slice that experience, though, and you're saying we want to write things, we want to produce things that are, in depth and quality, experience and contacts are what break stories and what bring in stuff. To me, it looks like a classic case of executives being like, well, we're going to, let's get things cheaper. Let's get the head count down. Let's get the costs down and force people to produce more for less. And it never ends up with better quality stuff. It just doesn't. I mean, it's just not going to happen. And we've seen that happen with loads of these kind of bastions of the 2010s media,
kind of BuzzFeeds of the world.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I think it's kind of interesting also at the same time when the things that are doing very well, particularly in the sort of Substack type environment, are individuals. Like people are signing up to hear from, as you were saying there, really high quality, experienced journalists. I mean, the sort of clickbaity stuff isn't even being highlighted anymore. I mean, do you think they're maybe stuck in serving the wrong audiences?
Possibly, yeah. I mean, I have to say firsthand, and Mick, I know you do this, and there's incredible people. Jim Watson runs a really fascinating Substack as well. To your point, it does feel like we're at a time. I think looking at Business Insider, their traffic has halved, or what was the figure? Yeah, it's halved in 5 years. So there are those challenges. But also the CEO saying we're going to go all in on AI suggests that it's still a bit of a race to the bottom. So yeah, possibly. But I do think there is something, and I think this applies to other businesses where you can see cuts happening. sometimes, the industry and industries evolves that quickly, and sometimes you find that the infrastructure is just far too large to sustain the business model that you have. That is just the reality. I'm not endorsing cuts, by the way, but the reality is, looking certainly in the areas I know, TV, film, where it's been about growth and hiring and sweeping up talent, and then at some point that levels off and people go, actually now we need to lose some of the headcount.
I think, Mick, there's also an interesting bit on keeping up with the trends and then suddenly realising that the world has changed, and the companies that are perhaps doing slightly better have changed with the mood of consumers and the way things are working.
Yeah, I think there's also a thing with what is Business Insider? What does it mean to read it? I think that it's one of those brands that's been a bit, because it has changed over the time quite a lot. There was a time when it was really pushing being just Insider, and then it went back to Business Insider. I'm not sure that it's a brand that has a reader loyalty to it, and that's why it was so subject to the whims of algorithmic changes, because what is it there for? What is its purpose? What does it mean? I thought that a long time ago when you looked at, I worked in music magazines, and when we started to try and be then a film magazine as well, and then all culture, and it's like, well, you're just trying to be everything, and that's still a problem now, I think. I don't know what Business Insider is meant to be. I think they're going to continue to struggle, because what's it for? What reader wants to go there specifically because it's Business Insider?
I think audiences are getting wise to some of the clickbaity tactics used as well, which I do think is why particularly individuals, credible journalists running Substacks, and people that are doing deeper dive investigative journalism, although fewer and further between than ever now, it seems to be increasingly popular. I mean, I signed up to the Manchester Evening News alerts or whatever because I used to live there and like to pretend that I'm still northern. And every 5 minutes you're getting a breaking news, major drama kicking off, and you just think, I think audiences are getting a little bit weary, hopefully, to that form of what I would say is, low-end journalism.
Yeah, and it's given space for stuff like the Manchester Mill to come in and provide something that's a lot more like, totally. We're going to get back down on the ground and do what local journalism used to do.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, when we return, should there be more morality in our newsrooms? I'll see you in a sec.
Hello Media Club listeners, Patrick here from Podcast Discovery, the podcast marketing company. I'm not just a voice on an advert, I'm a project manager. That means whether or not you need social and video, PR, paid spend or anything else, if you work with Podcast Discovery, you'll be working with real, friendly people. To find out more about the team or anything else to do with podcast marketing, head to podcastdiscovery.com. That's podcastdiscovery.com.
If you're a regular member of the Media Club, you know there's been a lot of discussion lately about how the audio space is shifting. New formats, new technology, and new ways to listen. But there's one thing that stayed the same. High quality content gives you the edge. That's why here at the Media Club, we use Podshop Studios to bring you the show each week with state-of-the-art commercial-grade recording equipment for both audio and video. Podshop has everything you need to make your podcast stand out. So if you're starting out with a podcast or a seasoned pro like us, Podshop guarantees professional recordings every time. You'll even benefit from a dedicated engineer on hand, ready to help with any technical details. So you can keep focused on the talking while they handle the rest. Right now, you can get 25% off your first booking. Just use the code MEDIACLUB at podshoponline.co.uk. Don't wait, take your podcast to the next level at Podshop Studios. Welcome back. Before we return to our guests, here's what we've been talking about in the Media Club this week. Last week, David Drennan told us Channel 4's new studio division would be good for the industry, but that's not quite how Sony's Wayne Garvie saw it. He said on Tuesday that starting a new production arm from scratch with no IP to speak of was preposterous, ridiculous, and potentially disastrous for the broadcaster. Don't hold back, Wayne. Meanwhile, weekly newspaper The New European has changed its name to The New World. Founder Matt Kelly told readers on Thursday, "I'd be looking for a way to reach new readers who feel exactly the same way about these new times as we all did in 2016 after the Brexit referendum." New hires include Sonia Soda from The Observer and Marie Leconte. And Adolescence is now Netflix's second biggest English language series with 141 million views and pushing Stranger Things into third place. Any guesses what's in first place? Anybody? It's Wednesday, the Addams Family spin-off.
I'm annoyed at myself. I did know that.
That's the most popular thing. Interesting about the New European becoming the New World. They're sort of saying liberal democracy, going sort of against authoritarianism everywhere. Sensible thing for them to do?
Yeah, I think so, because I think that when you look at what's been inside that paper for quite a long time, they have been expanding out and being more kind of having a more global vision. I almost said globalist then, and that was a totally different vibe. Yeah, I think it's sensible. I think what they've done quite well is create a tribe around that newspaper in a sense of. I'm a columnist for Byline Times, and I think they do a similar thing. It's like create this club around the paper and get people involved, and I think that's worked well for them.
Yeah, done about 2.5 million revenue, about 35,000 sort of subscribers, I think about 4,000 on the newsstand. So it's been probably the most successful, obviously recent newspaper launch. They're doing probably all the things that newspapers today should be doing. From a PR perspective, branding perspective, New European's a good name. People are aware of the product. Can they manage a change to the new world? Is that easy?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I think I dare say both titles are fairly boring and safe. So I think replacing one for another is absolutely fine. But I think there's always interesting things as to to what you guys were just saying in terms of why are you doing that? What has shifted outside of Europe? And we probably don't need to spend too long thinking about that. But yeah, I mean, it's always a challenge and it's always a risk, and people get very nervous about change and replacing titles and all of that stuff. But to be perfectly honest, I think most people now we all have such short-term thinking that newer companies, particularly media, can take the risk, and the reward is there.
Obviously, Mick, what should people do if they go to a newsagent?
To a newsagent, well, they should talk about their New World Order.
Oh, very good, very good. I didn't want you to not say the gang. It was a good one. Mick and Will
said that earlier.
Both forced it out of you.
Still with me. Okay, Mick, your book, Breaking How the Media Works. Hold it up. Breaking How the Media Works, when it doesn't,
there we are,
and why it matters, is all good bookstops, and
some bad ones too,
and available online as well. What should our listeners get out of it? Why should they buy it?
Well, this is bad advertising to say. The first thing to say is I didn't write it as a book for people who know a lot about the media. So it's a guide for people who are frustrated by the way that what they see in the media, and to give them a sense of how to separate the good from the bad, how to understand why bad media happens, and what are both the structural reasons for it, but also the interpersonal reasons, the historical reasons, all of that kind of thing. So it goes for everything from how do people become journalists. So it's a little bit of memoir at the start for me, but also looking at the history of journalism education in the UK and more widely. It looks at ownership, proprietors, political journalism, interviewing, what happens when you become the centre of a story, ethics, why do we still feel comfortable with huge media packs descending on small towns and communities when something tragic happens? It's pretty broad, basically. It covers a lot of areas. And I guess if you're someone who works in the media, buy it to see if I've mentioned you and been horrible about you, because there's no index, so you'll have to read the whole thing. You sort of invite people to look at the morality of the newsroom. What did you find when you started to do that? There are some things that we will say as journalists, well, we've always done that, or feel comfortable. I suppose the best example is the death knock. I think the death knock is treated as a kind of rite of passage for news journalists. So that's where, when someone dies, people basically knock on the family's door to sort of interview them unprompted. Yeah, exactly. And the example I use in the book of not doing that, I thought was a really good and fascinating move, was when there were shootings in Plymouth, and Plymouth Live came out and said, we're not going to do that. If you want to come to us if you want to speak to us about your experiences, come to us, but we're not going to go around and knock on doors. We're not going to do that because people in our newsroom have been affected. We know how it's affected the community. I think that was really interesting. Of course, the national press didn't follow that model, but I think that one personality can be okay, but then you look and it's 15, 20, 30, 100, and the experience for an individual and the trauma for the individual is huge. And I think that there are better and more responsible ways of going about that now. And I think there's a case, and it's a problem in any industry really, of within an organisation saying, well, we've always done it this way, and that then flows down into more junior stuff when they join. The cultures don't change unless people start to say, we could do this differently.
Obviously, you've been a journalist for a long time. You probably had a lot of views going into writing the book. Anything that sort of surprised you or changed your mind as you were researching it or talking to more individuals?
I guess there's a really established broadcaster for one of the news channels who I get on really well with. He said, I really like your work as a media critic, but what I find is, what worries me is people already don't have trust in the media, and you write, highly critical stuff about the media. Is that not just helping, the world of disinformation? Yeah. And it did make me think about it, and I did try to inject a little bit more positivity in there when I'm talking about stuff. But I think that if you go back 15, 20 years, there was a lot more media criticism within the media, like within newspapers. I don't know what you think, but I mean, you look back and the Guardian had such a strong media section and wrote about that, and there were media critics in other papers. The Independent used to do quite a lot of good media criticism, and I feel sort of post-Leveson, it's almost like there's this feeling of, well, we got through that, let's not look at ourselves too carefully.
I mean, in the national press, there's always been a sort of omerta of kind of not talking about each other. And occasionally things break through, and obviously Guardian, a lot of their coverage did things which the Murdochs weren't happy about. But there is a sort of unwritten rule, is that the families leave each other alone.
Yeah, definitely. And there's this, I've been told by sort of decent sources as well, that there's been a sense in the Guardian since they last changed editor that they've become a little bit more like, we shouldn't really attack the rest of the newspapers so much because we're all in the shit, so let's try and lift each other up. I don't think we've been in that situation for a while as well, where they're willing to go at each other. Yeah, of course there's a non-aggression pact between the Rothermeres and the Murdochs, and that's obvious. You can see that.
And we talk about kind of professionalism there, and I think we talked about AI as well in the first part of the show. I mean, AI can give a very professional sheen to unprofessional content. I mean, is there a big media literacy issue for punters of trying to understand what is truthful, what is honest, what is professional? In inverted commas, whereas in America, the whole idea of professionalism is bad. Experts don't know anything. Get rid of the experts.
I think there's a huge problem with that, but I think there's been a problem with that for a long time. I think it goes back to the demonization of media studies and the sense, particularly in that the Blair government era, of the constant attacks on media studies as a thing that's a Mickey Mouse degree. It's a Mickey Mouse subject. We don't need it, and that's done us a lot of damage. Now we should, we need better media literacy in adults, and we need people in school being taught really early on to be critical of sources and look more carefully at what's being produced. And with the growth of AI, it's only going to get harder. And so we need better media literacy, and I think we need to treat those subjects a little bit more seriously.
Well, it's such a good point, because and I'm guilty of it, because I study. I do probably what I do now, because in high school in Leeds really enjoyed media studies, then went to university and studied it, and almost went, not that it comes up that often, thankfully, when people ask what you did at university or whatever.
What course was it?
It was called Drama and Screen Studies, but it was the closest thing I could get to media studies without. No, you just said you're from Norwich. The other place I was going to go was East Anglia, which I hear is amazing university. It was just too far for me to commute back to Leeds. But I'm guilty of it, because when people ask about university, I say, I just did media studies, so I had all the time in the world, or it was watching films or whatever. And actually, when I'm talking to relatives and they're quoting things that they've read in the Daily Mail, or you're talking to nieces and nephews about where they get their information, it's so important that people have this understanding of how the media works, what the vested interests are. And I do think actually in the last few years, both politically and through things like COVID, everybody has got more of an understanding of how the media works, but
not always entirely correctly. They sort of know that there's maybe slightly more shades of grey, but do they go in the right direction?
Yeah, absolutely. But it's really important in this world of, so much more fake news, and actually a lot of the credible places giving good information, or reliable information, at least fact-based reporting, under attack. I think we do have to almost stop. I have to stop, and anyone else doing it as well has to stop the belittling of media studies and these sorts of the understanding that offers, because we need it.
I'm a proud media arts graduate myself as well.
Congratulations.
It's an interesting point about courses like this. I know that City University is sort of looking again at their sort of mix of studies for undergrads and postgrads. What should a journalism school be teaching nowadays? What's going to be important for the next 10 years, do you think?
I think looking at what City's saying that it wanted to do of helping people be better at managing communities and some of the online stuff, the way you work with online communities is obviously important. I think that the ethics of newsrooms is taught in these courses. I think it could be better taught. I think any time that they have practitioners coming in, I think it would be really useful to have more opportunities to speak to people who've been subjects of news stories. Yep. I don't think that happens enough. On the subject of literacy around the news as well, what we're just saying about sometimes people's literacy isn't so good. I think it's really another important thing to be taught in journalism courses, but just in education generally, is also the interaction between cock-ups and conspiracy.
Yes.
I have a whole chapter on that, because I think one of the things that people often mistake is that they think that newsrooms are so well organized and structured that it's possible to sort of to keep a coherent line. And I think that's really, it's the same thing when going back to talking about the BBC, this sense of the BBC is such a big and unwieldy operation, to think that it's possible to control it minutely.
A shadowy figure.
We're giving them far too much credit, aren't we?
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
The reality.
If there were more actual conspiracies in journalism, journalists give them enough free canapes and booze, and those conspiracies would come out very quickly.
It's very low level. It's
very low level.
Yeah. There was a few things I just wanted to say on the back of it, and I think Mick is being very humble about what is probably a fascinating book, and will be fascinating to people like me that work in media. And I remember when I was starting, Nick Davis's book, Flat Earth News, was such a seminal read for me, as particularly someone that doesn't read loads, but it was fascinating and depressing. But also, as a company, we work on lots of factual television, including recently things like the Nicola Bulley documentary that Rogan made, and which was part, retelling this horrific story, but also looking at the role of media, which was encouraging these kind of amateur sleuths, if you can even call them that, turning up and essentially making what was an awful situation for the family even worse. That's
a really good point, and I do write about the Nicola Bulley situation quite a bit in the book, because the scene that got me was Kay Burley and Sky's North of England correspondent walking through the village doing a live interview, and they just stop a guy, don't tell him he's live on Sky News, and start asking him about that. And that whole thing was so clearly wrong, and they knew quite early on what had actually happened. They did know quite early on, but as you say, the amateur sleuth thing, the true crime thing, I think something that is a sort of slow burning scandal in the British media is the way that look at the Daily Mail particularly, they're creating these true crime kind of podcast networks that and they will do podcasts on this stuff that is so exploitative. The Lucy Letby one the Mail did was honestly one of the most grotesque things I've ever had the misfortune to have to consume for work purposes, and I think that kind of stuff is a problem.
I mean, we're back to kind of the commercialization of media. I mean, hugely popular podcast, number one, the public's desire for this stuff. I mean, is the public complicit partly in this too? Yeah,
it's that old thing of the interaction between what is the public interested in and what is in the public interest, and we know the two things are separate. And the public does have to take some some responsibility for it. The Daily the Mail Online's Sidebar of Shame is so effective because we keep reading it, and I'm there too. Who is this starlet? I don't know. I'm going to read about it anyway.
Hold up a copy of the book. So that's Breaking How the Media Works, When It Doesn't and Why It Matters, out next week. Will, you've been pretty busy recently as always. BAFTA season, a couple of BAFTA awards to deal with.
Not for me personally, unfortunately. I still wait, do that valiant work, waiting for the call up for leading actor. Not come yet. Yeah.
Two good BAFTA awards?
BAFTA season, BAFTA awards, the TV awards, and we also do games and TV craft. TV craft qualified by the fact that it's incredibly still difficult. I don't want to always come on here and talk about the difficulties of the industry, but they exist and they're ongoing. I think people were saying survive until 25, and I have no idea what they're saying for 26, but...
be in the mix in 2026.
In the mix for 26, hopefully in the mix for something.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was really successful. And again, I'm not here to spew the Kool-Aid of BAFTA, but I think... particularly the TV awards, why people might not always think awards are necessary, who's watching them. The TV ratings remain incredibly strong. They give work that might not initially get recognised a chance to find an audience. And also we know what BAFTA does brilliantly year round. They're not just about the awards, but is making direct interventions where there are issues in the industry. So recently looking at the lack of opportunities for women directors and so forth. So that was very successful. We're always busy, but if you're a potential client out there, we love to hear from you. So please keep coming back.
There's always some bit of room on the roster.
There's always room.
Okay, just enough time for the Audio Network Media Quiz. Let's see how much attention to the media news this week our guests have been paying. Right, this week's is called Media Hacks Do Media Hacks. Those TikTok tutorials look so simple, don't they? A bite-sized life hack that makes chores a little easier. So here's 3 imagined life hacks based on media news stories from the week. All you got to do is tell me what the story is. And once again, Alex Audio Network has taken that incredibly tenuous brief from producer Matt and come up with an entire suite of music to score today's game. It's the best of 3. So buzz in with your name if you know the answer. So Will, you will say...
Will.
And Mick, you will say...
Mick.
Let's play Media Hacks Do Media Hacks. Right, let me get my influencer impression ready for you.
I didn't know it was this. Great, I'll pull up a chair.
I feel this is just playing against the talent. Right, here we go. Sup, bro? You've promised not to use NDAs to silence your employees.
Mick.
Thank God you've saved me from the rest of that. What is...
You could have given it a few more seconds. I
was trying to save you there. It's Channel 4 once again being rightly criticised for using NDAs to silence members of staff that have had grievances against the company, and it's the fact that they are sort of saying, well, it's not an NDA if it doesn't have NDA written at the top. But,
right.
I know that's what Zelda Perkins was saying, at least, the sense that these kind of agreements are still being used, but they're just calling them different things.
Yeah, so this is Deadline accusing Channel 4 of curbing free speech through settlements totaling almost £5 million. It's a lot of money, isn't it, Will?
It's a lot of money, and it never looks good for news organisations as well, this sort of chat. And, I would say... It is not to fall on a lot of the criticism of things that we've been talking about earlier, but it's the standard thing. People leave, or if they raise grievances, that might be dealt with, but that it will come with a very strict term that you can't then go and divulge information.
Mick, Channel 4 says their standard settlements have always had confidentiality clauses in them, but they have always been clear that this should never prevent individuals from raising issues of serious wrongdoing. Can those two things work together?
It often doesn't, because I think these legal agreements are quite frightening. And
even like the best will in the world.
Yeah, and even if you think that they're operating in the nicest possible way, I don't think that they are. That is just my opinion. But there's a wider issue with NDAs in the news industry, in the broadcast news industry, that needs to come out. I worked on an investigation last year about it. It's the other difficulty with dealing with these things is that the legal powers of these broadcasters, they come down pretty hard when you try and investigate these as well. So it comes back to what we were talking about earlier as well, of individuals versus organizations. To do investigations into this kind of stuff, it's a lot better if you've got an organization behind you with some legal clout to help you.
You've got some good lawyers. Okay, media hack number 2. Low-key stressing after a BBC documentary about you. Bring them into the High Court and win 100k in euros.
Mick.
Yep.
It's Jerry Adams who has won a legal victory in the High Court over a BBC documentary that essentially accused him of being involved in someone's murder.
I mean, regardless of the kind of merits of the case, there's always kind of worries about the sort of chilling effects from these sorts of rulings. Does it mean anything different for kind of Northern Irish media? Will they think about any of these things in a different way? Yeah,
I think it's a very difficult world over there. I'm married to a Northern Irish woman, so I have a lot of Northern Irish family. It takes me back to appearance by Jerry Adams on a late night talk show by a guy called Vincent Brown back when he was standing to be president of Ireland. And Jerry Adams denies that he was ever a member of the IRA. And during that interview, Vincent Brown just kept getting, every time he asked him whether he'd been a member of the IRA, he got another book out that claimed that Jerry Adams had been a member of the IRA. And by the end of the interview, it was a very big stack. So it's been a long-running thing, this. I think that the BBC documentary here has fallen foul of some difficulty in wording that has ended up coming out on the wrong side for them. I think I'm slightly surprised about it, though, if I'm honest.
Okay, media hack number 3. Short of celeb interviews for your European magazine, why not try this well-chewy hack? Yassify it. They'll probably know or something.
Well, is this something about Clint Eastwood?
It is.
About someone pretending that they had interviewed him, but then he came out quite strongly and said, I've had nothing to do with this.
Yeah, Clint Eastwood used a statement after Austrian mag Curia published an interview that was apparently never given by the Hollywood legend. Has this happened to any people in the UK as well?
I'm sure it has, yeah. I'm trying to wrap my brains as to whether...
Any clients like, I don't think I spoke to this person.
Yeah, well, that happens a lot, but often it turns out that they have and they just don't want to admit it.
Is there people like taking little conversations at parties and turning them into full features?
Well, perhaps. I can't say that it's... As I know, I mean, I'm not hugely involved in the personal PR side of what we do anymore, but I don't think I'm aware that it's happened with... I'd like to think I would know about it if it happened with any of our clients. But I dare say it will happen, or things get complete, or the other thing that happens often is it's one quote that is then blasted into one big, huge interview on the front page. Or whatever. The most shocking thing, how old is Clint Eastwood?
95.
95? Why are we doing this to a 95-year-old? Isn't he entitled to a peaceful existence now? Surely.
Can you remember being interviewed? That's the question.
I think this became an issue, though, because it got aggregated to places like Deadline, who are then the outlet that reported the comments from Clint saying, I didn't say this stuff. Yeah. So I think they would have gone under the radar if it hadn't have been, picked up and not checked by a lot of bigger outlets. I mean, Deadline should know better, shouldn't they, really?
Well, congratulations, Mick. First time luck there, winning the quiz. My thanks to Will Wood and Mick Wright, and of course to Alex at Audio Network for this week's Suite of Music. Remember, they can do this for your next project as well. Just head to their website, audionetwork.com. So, gents, where can people keep up with your good work? Will, where can they find your firm?
Find our social media account, so look on multitudemedia.co.uk and you can find out all the things that our team are working on, including things like the forthcoming season of Gladiators. Mick, will you be watching?
Yes, me and my family love Gladiators.
Excellent.
My stepdaughter is a huge fan of Gladiators.
Well, come along, please. And things like Last One Laughing, which is about to start filming. So, and then on the more serious end, we have an upcoming documentary made by Rogan and Netflix about Grenfell, which will be a really important watch.
So, Last One Laughing, have they announced who's in it yet?
They haven't announced who's in it yet, but watch this space.
Mick, give me a plug for what you're up to as well as the book.
I have a Substack. It's called Conquest of the Useless. You can find it if you search that. It's the second hit under the book by Werner Herzog, where I stole the title. It's brokenbottleboy.substack.com.
And thank you for watching as well. Remember, you can head to our Substack at themediaclub.com, sign up for free and get an update every week from us about the show. My name is Matt Deegan. The producer was Matt Hill. It was a Rethink audio production with video support from Podcast Discovery. And I'll see you next week.